oh, maybe there are like experts out there that know more about this, even though it's my story to tell. Um, but at the end of the day, like just by the virtue of it being my story, I have the priority of telling it. We kept hearing about this. Everybody was talking about the Kurds, but who was talking to the Kurds?
You're listening to Calling Others. Calling Others is a podcast miniseries featuring the stories of young Swana American creatives and advocates. This podcast is a little reminder. Our personal stories matter. They have more power over politics than we realize. I'm your host, Nastar Anfar, and this episode's guest is Yara Ismael. Yara is of Iraqi and Kurdish descent and immigrated to the US at age 13. On top of being a full-time student, Yara is a founding member of 2 organizations that engage with Kurdish populations. The Effendi Foundation focuses on the civic participation of Kurdish Americans, and the Kurdish Refugee Relief Foundation deals with improving access to menstrual products for Kurdish people in refugee camps. In this episode, we talk about the messiness of demilitarization, diasporic existential crises, gender roles, the taboo of menstruation, and more. Here's our conversation in today's episode.
We had a kind of impromptu advocacy campaign in the fall of 2019 when the US announced that it will be pulling out its troops from northern Syria, the Kurdish region of northern Syria, and that prompted a Turkish invasion into the country. So we kind of had to ramble and work on, here in the US to try to advocate for the US to at least slow down the pullout of the troops to prevent the genocide from happening when the Turkish government invades. We started working here in Southern California, and it kind of became a national campaign with protests, trying to spread some awareness about what's happening, and also advocacy meetings on the Hill and in local district offices. What we kind of realized through that whole campaign is that we need a little bit more infrastructure for our own community, because unfortunately that was not the first time that something like that happened, and we were cognizant of the fact that it's probably not going to be the last time that it happened, but we kind of always responded in a very frantic way to when things happened like that, and we felt like we needed more of a structure. So some of the people who reached out to us wanted to contribute to helping the refugees, for example. We realized that we couldn't find a specific organization that could answer to what they wanted. So that's how the Kurdish Refugee Relief Foundation was born. And we focus on menstrual hygiene items and sustainability when it comes to that in the refugee camps of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And for the Effendi Foundation, we started with the census campaign to kind of get more engagement by the Kurdish community, American community, and try to get more understanding of the community to be able to have a more robust response to advocacy campaigns or to just like civic engagement in general.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like that must have been like a very difficult journey to take, but I'm really happy that you were able to do that and to like organize your community. I think that's something more of us should be like thinking about when it comes to our diaspora communities, and I think it's really cool to see you do that. What is the purpose of the Effendi Foundation and the Kurdish Refugee Foundation, and what are the goals for each organization?
Important pillars to that organization is that we recognize that the Kurdish American community is a community by itself, and some of our issues might not be relevant to people back at home or to other communities worldwide, and we must in our community feel this like lack of understanding that maybe politics in America is just as important as politics in Kurdistan, because then it'll, even if you have some interest back in Kurdistan, having a more powerful presence here will allow you to have that influence even when it comes to US foreign policy in Kurdistan. So we understand that the power begins with the individual and their understanding of their own power. So we try to work on campaigns like the census, voting, to get people to understand that even though your vote might have not mattered before when you were back home, here it does matter, even if it's just one vote. Even though we have a democracy, people, it's not very much like inviting people to participate. That was kind of a difficult understanding, is that it's open, but you kind of have to push yourself and your people to get in it. Um, and I think the other part of it was to kind of build that Kurdish American identities through community events, through introducing our community to the society, but also introducing the society to our communities. For the Kurdish Refugee Relief Foundation, we wanted to have a focus on women refugees that kind of was not the traditional sewing or like little workshops, that we wanted to have a more transformative impact. So even though like something could be considered, menstrual hygiene items could be considered a small issue by some people, it really speaks to, this is a woman's rights, that's a human right that is neglected and considered taboo, even though it's just a normal human thing. So we wanted to kind of target a taboo subject without being too quote unquote aggressive about it, um, while also helping with relief efforts. So that was the idea behind the menstrual health items for the for the refugees in the Kurdistan region in general. But once we got started and saw some of the complications for the women and the organizations on the ground, we realized it must be sustainable, because we can't go back in every couple of months. And it's also very environmentally harmful with the plastic waste that it produces. So that's why right now we're exploring different options that are more sustainable.
I think that's something that you wouldn't think about on the first try, you know? You wouldn't be like it would be about getting access and then thinking through, like, those options that make it more sustainable. I think that's something more organizations should be considering, especially when they're providing, like, direct on the ground relief. Can you talk a little bit more about how sustainability, is rooted in your approach?
With Care Art, we hope to have specific reusable products uh, that can last these women for a few years, and then we hope to like just transition to more camps once these specific products are used. But in order to kind of increase that sustainability is to also like build partnerships with the appropriate companies and organizations here in the US, but also to ensure that these products are actually going to be used. So because of like some cultural barriers for certain products, that's why we're implementing a study. First we did a survey, then we're gonna do like another survey, and then an actual study. It might seem like, oh, okay, that's kind of a waste, but like we have one of the products already available to us that we can distribute tomorrow, but we feel like the women are not going to be actually receptive to it. They might not say no to getting a free product, but they might not use it, and like at the end of the day we haven't solved any problem. They will still be asking for those disposable pads or other items. And it's also like just much more environmentally sustainable and environmentally friendly. So we hope that like we can find one at least that will suit the woman.
I would love to hear a little bit about what this advocacy work tells us about you and your cultural history, your upbringing, your family, and your identity.
I think as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's like this work kind of became part of me, and I became a part of this work because it helped me find my own identity and form it through all of this kind of work. It kind of always comes down to a question of like, because it's also when you have these conversations with people who question what you do, I always sit down with myself and just think through responses, and I always ask myself why. And I think for me, as I was born and raised in Baghdad. I grew up with an Arab mom and a Kurdish dad. It was always this like, I started off the world with a kind of identity crisis. Which one was it? Because I like it's always like, oh, you don't speak Kurdish enough, or you don't speak Arabic enough. Um, but I was actually this shy kid that did not use to speak up a lot. And it was the Kurdish cause that gave me a voice, because I felt like I needed to speak to that cause to lend in my voice. But in order to do that, I had to create a voice for my own to begin with. And the first time I like just got up in my middle school class in this Arab school in Baghdad and just said, you know what, today is we're going to talk about the Halabja genocide that was perpetrated by Saddam Hussein's regime, because we need to keep the memory alive. And you guys, even though live here, I bet you don't really know a lot about what happened because of the media bias. And that was the first time that I told this story. And since then, I've just been involved with a lot of different ways to try to tell those stories. And when I came to the United States, I was just very against moving here. So it felt like I was betraying my own country. So I started to like find ways to give back, to find the community here, because I wanted to like see if other people were feeling the same way. So like 6 months into moving to the United States as a 13-year-old, I was like looking for different charities and organizations here, and like I got involved with one and did some relief work for refugee camps back home. But I think throughout this process, I learned a lot about the relief translating into reform, and I'm grateful for the relief work that we did before. But I think that's why my appreciation for sustainability and trying to embed that within both organizations now stems from, is trying to actually have a more lasting change. I always say the way I define myself, who I am, I have like a very specific order. It's like I'm a human first, then I'm my family's daughter, then I'm Muslim, then I'm Kurdish, then I'm Arab. And I think the reason why like that order matters to me is because of how each of those things contributes to the person that I am. I can't claim any other thing if I can't be human first, and I can't do any of this work because I just think it's ridiculous. I mean, I used to be more nationalistic, definitely, when I started doing this work, but like it's so ridiculous. You can't justify something is a right if you don't consider that right to be universal. Um, and set like just the values that each of these things that my family instilled in me, that my religion taught me about my spirituality, and like the grand scheme of things, and then my ethnicities taught me about like the everyday life. How do we do weddings? How do we eat? It's a changing journey. I don't think we ever know who we are, and we're always on the quest of finding that, and maybe forming who we are as we question who we are.
Yeah, that was so beautiful. I think that's a great way to put an existential crisis into like a really a really like affirming sense. I feel like for a lot of us who are in the diaspora, I mean, especially like coming from two different spaces, um, for you and having to balance that, it comes with a lot of like building your own identity. I think everyone has to do that. I think if you're a diaspora member, you're allotted a little bit of a heavier workload
Yeah.
when you have to go through that journey. So thank you
But it
for
gives us more
explaining that to me.
options. We get to
Yeah,
choose the
that's
good
true.
things.
We do. We get to pick parts of things that we
Exactly.
really enjoy. Yeah, which I think is really cool, and I mean I'm grateful for it, even though it comes with some loss on both ends, I'm sure, and some discomfort. Um, so getting more into the specifics of your work and your identity, I'd love to hear about specific personal experiences that led you to founding these organizations. If there were conversations you had with people in your life, your family, yourself, that drove you to these issue areas, that drove you to this work.
When I first started getting involved and just like, oh yeah, like the Kurdish cause and the community and trying to give back, as a young woman, it definitely was a little bit hard. I mean, I was privileged and a lot luckier than so many young girls, but it was still a little hard to be heard, or taken like absolutely seriously. It's like, oh, you're so cute and adorable for saying all these things and caring about them. Like I give like a presentation to the community about like three different ideas of things to do, and then the conversation that I have after, like with these sweet people, but they're like, oh, whose daughter are you? And so she's like, oh, who's your dad? Oh, and then who's your mom? And like all of these like personal questions that feels like it's belittling my ideas a little bit or like not acting on them. And it's like a community wide issue that I think we tend to do a little bit more talking than acting in general, but it's like specifically for women, I think it's a little bit more. And that's what led me to say, like, I want to create our own space. So both organizations are actually very much women dominated. Um, I think I've worked like when I even worked with like some Kurdish professional spaces and just like seeing how women their job descriptions in real life are different. Like if a woman occupies a certain like role, somehow her job description includes managing the office a little bit more, making sure that like the kitchen, like it's like everybody has like a duty to take care of their own dishes, but like at the end of the day, it's like her job to make sure it's like taken care of if somebody doesn't do it. Uh, I just was like, I don't want that. Like it's not cute that I'm out. Like maybe it's cute that like I'm trying to be outspoken, but it means a little bit more than that. Um, and that is, I think, well, like how I decided that like it's okay to be woman dominated in some spaces. It doesn't mean that we're creating like echo chambers for ourselves. We still try to include men as much as possible, but they're a little bit less active, to be fair.
Yeah. I think going off of what you were saying about just like engaging more with women, I'd love to hear about your experience in engaging with more of like a taboo subject, like you had said before, periods and menstrual cycles. How was that experience for you?
It's interesting. I think like even like my family is pretty progressive and like talking to like big family gatherings about this. Even with like some people that I thought like were like they always like talk about women's rights, like somehow like still talking about that in front of my male cousins or something is like, oh, you're talking about periods. Um, I think it's still interesting that like even with like men who are very close to me in my life, I try to sugarcoat things, I think, a little bit with them because even though if, like they don't say anything bad, the way like I just feel like this a little bit of an awkward moment between us when I talk about these things. And then I'm like, I don't care. Like I have a whole organization where I'm trying to tell people like it's okay to talk about periods. Like don't expect me to like uh hold too much back. Like when I'm talking about it. But I think that it's just because they are not used to listening to that. Um, and even the women are kind of the ones who self censor a little bit more. Because if we wanted to talk about it, like let them blush. Next time they hear about it, they'll be fine. Like don't try to censor yourself or me. It's not this little joke. It's a human right, and it's normal to say, well, you know what, I'm now fasting today. Don't try to sneak in that food or that glass of water. Like let them interpret it, even if you're not comfortable saying why at this moment. Just it's one step at a time. I think. Like I truly believe in that, and I don't necessarily think like we have to push for the extreme right away. Unfortunately, it does tend to radicalize people to their extremes. But even having like sometimes I one time had this conversation about like why can't women lead prayer? Nothing is against that, and then like I was like that is kind of a counterproductive approach. Next time I'll start with let's have one praying room, and then once we agree on that, I'll take you to the next level.
Yeah, you have to be, like, aware of the audience and, like, where like, everyone is coming from when you're having those conversations. I love the phrase "let them blush." It's very powerful. I really liked hearing that. I think that being able to engage in this kind of work takes, like, a huge level of interpersonal understanding, and I can tell that, like, when you're having those conversations, you've had to navigate generational divides, relationships, gendered relationships. I wanna go in a slightly different direction, and talk to you a little bit about how personal storytelling plays into your organizing work. Um, how do you feel like personal storytelling has affected your advocacy and organizing work? Has it been a source of power? Has it been something that you've used as a tool? Obviously, what we're doing here in this space is trying to show how personal storytelling is powerful. So I'd love to hear if that's something you have explored in your work as well.
I think I was when I was like thinking about this, I was thinking of it from like my individual perspective, but also like the personal storytelling about like other people. We tend to, obviously, like just having that personal experience gives you like the extra credits, in a sense of like, you know what, I have a right to talk about this, like, and it's we tend to like shy away from that because it's like, oh, maybe there are like experts out there that know more about this, even though it's my story to tell. Um, but at the end of the day, like just by the virtue of it being my story, I have the priority of telling it, and then you can add your commentary about it. And I think that was the first time, like in 2019, when we kind of claimed that we kept hearing about this. Everybody was talking about the Kurds, but who was talking to the Kurds. And to be fair, like most of the outreach that we did, we had to reach out to these news organizations and platforms and be like, you know what, you've been talking about this issue, but like you have not tried to reach out to any Kurds. And it's like not in an aggressive way because I understand like sometimes it requires a little bit more research to reach the right community, and that's like why one of the reasons why Effendi Foundation was born is to kind of like have a point where like it's like you can reach out to these people and they'll connect you to someone in the community. That's why we started like trying to find a database for Kurdish Americans and to learn more about our own community to be kind of a connection point.
It's interesting because when you present one person's story as the universal story, you end up wiping out like, you're trying to, like yeah, you're trying to illustrate something to people, but you end up actually taking away from people, and that even that is something that I think a lot of media, and publications don't even do, most of the time, it's like the number, there's no story. Um, this is a large question, so prepare yourself for it. Um, how do you feel like your personal and political mix? Answer this as specifically or as generally as you feel comfortable. Um, I'd just love to hear about how you felt your identity has been politicized, um, and how you've experienced that, if at all.
I think my understanding of the sentence "where you stand" depends on where has just like been a lot better recently, and it's allowed me to realize that like you know what, like my personal does affect my political a lot. And what I said earlier about like being a human is universal and like having your political beliefs based on a universal view is really hard, because your understanding is also affected. Not just like what you see as a benefit in return to for your own personal life, is also like your understanding of things is biased depending on your own experiences. And I've just had a very like much clearer understanding of that recently. So I always tend to be a little bit more flexible on my political views now than I used to be, or a little bit more understanding of the other side to be like, you know what, I feel like maybe that's where they're coming from. And although like I don't agree with them and I think there should like be a little more effort to understand our side, I could see where they're coming from. I think the personal like just my whole story of like why I even got involved with politics to begin with was my own personal experience and feelings, and my choice to continue uh is a little bit more intentional, I think. Growing up, like everybody was like, yeah, of course, like you're passionate about this. Every Kurd goes through this phase, like we've all gone through this phase and then we go back to real life. um and we understand that the Kurdish cause, or like just like human rights, is just like a hobby for Kurds. And I think I understood a little bit what they meant. Yeah, my faith in the cause did get shaken a lot. But it allowed me to it introduced me to this larger world where, like, what I've learned about this world through my involvement with the Kurdish cause is applicable everywhere else. Even if, like, while I'm now thinking about, like, what kind of law will I be working on, just the coalitions that I've built with people through working on Kurds allowed me to understand, like, a little bit more about other causes, and understand that I like that is the kind of passion that I have. It doesn't have to deal with these people, um, but also like those experiences give us like a more nuanced understanding. Even though we argue in general for demilitarization of everything, our campaign that started my organizations was to tell people, those American soldiers, to stay, uh, because we knew that like the alternative was worse.
Yeah, that's such a complicated position to have had to take.
Exactly. Because it's like, you know what? We know like those 100 American soldiers have a presence, but like they're not trying to like take over that region right now. But the Turkish soldiers will, and they committed a lot of crimes against humanity when the invasion did happen. And even afterwards, they're still continuing to try to erase the Kurdish identity of from the region. It's just the world is pretty complicated, and sometimes you can't say. Even when the U.S. soldiers were leaving Iraq, and like me living in Baghdad at the moment, it's a lot more complicated to live in that moment than to be here in the US and be like, no, we do not want to be in another country. Well, you just left abruptly and left the country in shambles. You weakened the institutions the entire time you were there. Same with Afghanistan. It's like the people just reached a point where they were like, you know what? We know at this point, whenever you leave, you're gonna leave the country worse off. So like, might as well just rip the band-aid off. But like at one point, people might think, uh, we need a little bit of time to kind of get our house in order, because the entire time you were here, you co-opted these institutions and like said nobody gets to do anything. I think it's just like a little bit more made me realize that human rights is a little bit less black and white than we expect it to be. And sometimes different countries need different solutions. And it's not to say that some rights are not universal, but like the way we go about it might be different.
You had mentioned, your experience growing up in Iraq and being there during the time where the conflict that a lot of us understand more from the US perspective and have like certain even from an anti-war perspective are affected by that. I'd like to get a better understanding of what your experience was living there in Iraq at that time during which that conflict was getting resolved and was being executed and all of that.
During this one specific conflict, I was a baby. So I remember one of the stories my mom used to tell me was that like I would always want new pacifiers and new bottles, and like at night I would cry, and like sometimes it's actual rain and sometimes it's just like there is no electricity, and there is like bombing happening, and my mom would take me outside and be like, listen, see, it's raining, we have to go tomorrow morning. And it's like I always say this, where it's like, you know what, I can tell those stories. Those stories did happen. Life was difficult. Simple things became more difficult if we wanted to get English books, or like an actually good. Even though I was enrolled in private school, so was my sister. It was still not up to the standard that my parents wanted us to have in an education. And like they would have to go to a neighboring country to get us another school's curriculum and teach us at school, even though we're going full time to another school, to just like get simple things. It was a lot more difficult. But at the same time, I always say, like, I can make my life also just what it was, normal and like fun. And people still had, like, our normal was different, but it was still pretty normal and pretty fun. And life continues. And I think that's what teaches us, like, even when we see what happens in other countries, or we see like what's happening in Ukraine. It's like we sympathize with everything that's happening to those people. We understand like how difficult life will be from now on, because you never get out of that. War is like is always going to be there even after it ends, and the experiences that your one generation does not have because of the war will take a few generations to resolve. And I think that's what a lot of people back home are realizing. It's like has not moved on yet, and like still difficult in the daily life when it comes especially to the rest of Iraq. But like the Kurdistan region as well, it's like, okay, well, we do have varying educational levels even for the diaspora. It's because of the parents and the grandparents, and it takes a few generations to move on from that.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. And that's a very heavy space. So I appreciate you going there with me. What advice would you give to people who are thinking about organizing their own communities and creating that space?
Sometimes it's just building bridges with these people. And like we had a series for Effendi Foundation where sometimes one of the things we talked about was mother-daughter relationships, and just having the community engage with each other more makes it so much easier to kind of spread the awareness about anything else. So I think it doesn't have to be in any traditional sense at all, and it doesn't have. Don't push for yourself to be like my community needs to be 100% organized. Just a little bit goes a long way, and some communities are a little bit more receptive to that kind of stuff than others are.
How can people who are listening support you and support your work?
I think that just having an understanding of everything that I talked about and the issues really, really helpful. When it comes to specific things, we always welcome a lot of support and help in any capacity for both organizations. We have some events for Effendi Foundation when it comes to Kurdish Heritage Month that are more national focused, but all of that information can be found on both our websites and social media platforms about upcoming campaigns. And I think, as I mentioned, for CareR, we're having a study coming up, but before that, we're having a panel for the US where we talk about the sustainable products. And it's catered more to the Kurdish American community, but everybody's welcome to just kind of understand more, a little bit more about the work that we do, but also about these products that we think are more sustainable and why that's important. So that will also be coming up next month. And more information can be found about that on our social media handles, or you can just get in touch directly if you want to talk about anything that I said or have any more ideas for organizations or even outside the scope of organizations. I'm also available for any of that kind of conversations.
Thank you so much, Yara.
Thank you, Nastaran.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can continue supporting Yara's work on Instagram at Effendi Foundation or at Kurdish Refugee Relief. Thank you for listening. You can find Calling Others on major podcast platforms or on Win Without War's website. The music found in this episode is from Storyblocks, and this episode was produced and edited by me, Nasta Anfar, and Natalie Bettendorf. See you next time.